Guys, before we get started and read the rest of our story about George Washington, let's just talk a little bit about from our map about what we've learned about the things that he's done so far. So we know George Washington, we said he was born almost 300 years ago. And yesterday we learned that he became a surveyor, that's somebody who measures land, at only 16 years old. Now we haven't learned any of this other stuff, but today we're going to learn about him meeting Martha, becoming a general, becoming the first president, and then naming the capital of the United States after him. So let's go do that now. George Washington, our first president, written by Garnet Jackson and illustrated by Cornelius Van Wright and Ying Hua Hu. Living in the wilderness helped George to become an even greater leader. When he was only 20 years old, he became a major in the Virginia Army. Why do you think living in the wilderness helped George become a good soldier? Well, back then, soldiers would travel a lot out in the wilderness to get to different places to fight battles. So already knowing how to navigate and be in the wilderness probably helped him a lot. In 1754, a war broke out. French settlers and Native Americans in the Ohio Valley would not let the English settlers have farms there. George Washington was called to help the English settlers. He was now Colonel Washington. He led the English soldiers, and they won the war. Everyone looked up to Colonel Washington. A colonel is an important person in the army. A colonel tells many other soldiers what to do. One day, George met a lovely lady named Martha Custis. She was a widow with 2 children. They fell in love and were married in 1759. Mount Vernon is really close to Washington, D.C., the capital of our country. But do you know what? George, at this point, had never even heard of Washington, D.C. Why do you think that is? See if you can figure that out. George and Martha Washington moved into a beautiful mansion in Mount Vernon, Virginia. They had many parties, laughter, and fun in their home. But Colonel Washington was soon called to war again. It was 1775. America was a very small country with only 13 colonies then. During this time, England ruled America. The rulers in England were mistreating America. They wanted America to pay unfair taxes. A war broke out. The Americans chose George Washington as their leader. The war lasted 8 years. The colonel was now General George Washington. Through his leadership, the American colonies won the war. America was no longer ruled by England. The colonies became the United States of America. Americans were very happy, but the new little country needed a leader. Everyone in the land wanted one and only one man for this job, General George Washington. So they made him the first president of the United States of America on April 30th, 1789. On the day of his inauguration, President George Washington rode on a beautiful white horse on his way to the ceremony. The inauguration is when a person becomes the president. On that day, the person has to promise to be a good president. Hooray! People cheered when President Washington stood before them to give his speech. Some people cried with joy. President Washington was a great president. He traveled all over America to see what the country needed. He passed good laws to help America. George Washington was president for 8 years. Afterwards, he went back to his home in Mount Vernon. He enjoyed good times and laughter again with Martha, his family, and friends. Americans will never forget the first president of their land. All right, so let's look again at our map about George Washington and talk about all the other things we learned. So yesterday we learned about him being a surveyor. Today when we started reading, we first learned about him meeting Martha. That's his wife, Martha Washington, how he lived in Mount Vernon. We learned how he became a general in the Army. Okay, so the general is an important job that's in the Army. They help make decisions for other soldiers. They're in charge of a lot of other soldiers. Because he was such a good general in the American Army and he was our leader, people made him our first president. Everyone loved him and wanted him to be the very first leader of our country. So he was our first president. And then they named the capital of our country, Washington, D.C., after him. So when he first moved to Mount Vernon with Martha, he didn't know anything about Washington, D.C., because they hadn't named the city after him yet, because he hadn't been the president yet, right?